Hello and welcome. All right, plan for today is to cover stress. Finally, something that everybody can relate to here. So before I get started, does anybody have any questions about yesterday's lecture? No? Okay. All right, let's talk about stress and coping and health. And I've got the recording on, so we are good. Let's first get just some textbook definitions and talk about semantics here. Because when lay people talk about stress, they're oftentimes talking about a lot of different things. And so just from a psychology standpoint, let's separate these three things. So the stressor would be the thing in the environment, like being in a pandemic as an example, would be a stressor. Sometimes stressors can be internal. So it could be like a thought that you have that creates a sense of stress in your mind and in your body. The stress perception is going to be filtered through you as an individual. Okay. So what one of you could perceive as being, let's say a boss gives you extra work, a separate project that, he wants you to work on. Some individuals could feel like totally overwhelmed, like I can't handle more work. I've got enough work to deal with. And another person could actually see that as an opportunity to be able to prove themselves. So some people could see it as overwhelming. Some people could see that stress perception as being more of a, great, I've got a challenge here, or I've got an opportunity here. The stress response, sometimes this is called strain, would be the whole effect that it has on the mind, the whole effect that it has on your emotions, and then the whole physical response that you might have in your body. Okay, so stressor is more like the antecedent. Stress perception is going to be filtered through that which is unique about you. And then the stress response, called strain, is what we oftentimes talk about, fight or flight or freeze response. Questions here? Okay. All right. This is a very long textbook definition, so let me kind of read it out loud to you, but I want you to be able to get it in your notes in a way that makes sense, put it into your own words. So let's just kind of walk through this. So stress is this particular relationship between the person and the environment that person is going to appraise as being taxing or exceeding his or her resources and possibly endangering his or her well-being. So relationship between person and environment, the person is appraising it, that's that stress perception we just talked about, appraising it as taxing or exceeding resources and endangering well-being. So a more simplified way would be unwanted change. And does anybody have a way of sort of putting that in your own words? Okay, so unwanted change. Okay, let's talk about Hans Seyle. He says that we human beings have evolved in a way, and he calls our experience of stress a general adaptation response. But keep in mind, the general part of it is that we tend to respond to stress regardless of the stressor. Like, let's say you're taking a very difficult math exam and your body gets that fight or flight or freeze response, which would not at all be adaptive to your ability to concentrate on a math exam. If, on the other hand, you've got somebody threatening you physically and you get that physical response that mobilizes that energy and you're able to fight off that offender, then the response is going to be adaptive. So it's a general response that is not necessarily tailored to the particular type of stressor. And according to Seyle, we have evolved this fight or flight or freeze response across evolution when we were being hunted by prey. So it makes a lot of sense that we would get this vast energy store as our ability to respond. Okay. Now, the problem with modern day stress is most of us do not have stress on a daily basis where a saber-toothed tiger or bear or something's chasing us trying to eat us. That's just not the nature of modern day stress. But our mind and our body keeps reacting to stress exactly the same way. Okay. So our bodies think that mental stress requires a physical response when it does not. Any questions here? That it's all about mobilizing energy. Okay. Okay. And then Seyle says that when we go through our response to stress, depending on how prolonged the stressor is, we go through these stages. And I want us to kind of think through these. So in the alarm stage, so we've got a brand new stressor in front of us. That fight or flight or freeze is all about mobilizing energy. So everything that happens to us physically allows us to take in more oxygen. Our heart is going to be racing. It's going to be pumping out more blood. Our muscles are going to be getting that oxygen and they're going to be getting that energy so that we can either fight or we can run away, or in some cases kind of play possum and freeze and just sort of play dead, that type of thing. It's all about mobilizing energy. If that stressor keeps going beyond that initial type of alarm stage, then we hit what Seyle called a resistance stage. And at this point in time, I want us to pay attention to what's going on down here. About 15% of our energy at any given time in our body is in our immune system. And if we move into this resistance stage, our immune system is going to temporarily increase. And who wants to speculate as to why we would get this immune system increase after we've gone through alarm, the stressor's still persisting? What would be the adaptation of that? So our body's mobilized energy, and now we have increased our immune system response. Wouldn't it make sense, again, across history? I'm talking about evolution. I'm not talking about modern day stressors. Wouldn't it make sense that if we've perceived this threat, so we're out there picking berries, taking it back to our tribe, and then across the field there is a saber-toothed tiger, and we're going to do our best to flee, try to get back to the cave, crawl in our cave, make sure the door is shut on the cave so that the saber-toothed tiger can't get in there. Doesn't it make sense that in those circumstances, we were likely to get hurt? So we might be running, we might trip and, you know, bust open our knee and our elbow, or if that tiger got a hold of us and bit us or scraped us, it makes a lot of sense that in those kind of stressful situations, we were likely to get injured, and that immune system response was adaptive. Like it's kicking in preparation for some kind of injury to try to help us out there. If the stressor keeps going, and again, we've talked about immune system takes about 15% of our energy. We've mobilized all of this energy here. At some point in time, it's sort of like basic physics, that we have a finite amount of energy at any given time. If we have used all that energy for muscle mobilization, we've used all that energy for our immune system, we are going to get exhausted, right? Because we are just spent at that point. So in the exhaustion stage, both our energy and our immune system are overwhelmed. And what do you think happens to human beings when that stressor has been that prolonged that a person reaches exhaustion?
Immunity decreases.
You got it. That's when people get sick. Yeah. That's sort of like, and you all can probably relate to that type of thing. Like you've pushed it, the stressor's been there, and then you get sick, and then different people's bodies break down in different ways. Some of you get headaches, some of you get stomach aches. I know when I'm really stressed, I tend not to sleep as well. And then I can go through one night of poor sleep, but 2 nights of poor sleep, and I wake up and I either have a sinus infection or bronchitis. You know, it's like, that's my vulnerability. You all probably have other kinds of vulnerabilities. But yeah, so, I mean, we talked about this when we talked about the 6 pathways. in the intro lecture, prolonged stress is going to create illness. It can create psychological disorders and it can create medical illness. Okay, so prolonged stress is definitely bad for us. Any questions here? Okay. I want to talk about this normal homeostasis that occurs for many of us, that anabolism is when our body is building and rebuilding itself. This is when our body is healing itself. And again, normal immune system we talked about takes about 15% of our daily energy. And anabolism, that body's healing itself, cell replication, the body healing itself, for most of us happens during periods of non-stress. And for most of us, this is what is happening when we're sleeping. It's like the biological imperative of human beings needing sleep, that the body is rebuilding itself during sleep. Which is part of the reason why when we're working with individuals who are experiencing chronic stress, we oftentimes target sleep as one of the first line of defenses. And there's all kinds of things that we can do to help people sleep better, improve their sleep if they're having problems with their sleep. Okay, because you want this anabolism, you want the body healing, particularly if an individual has some type of chronic illness or an individual has some kind of injury. Yeah. Now, catabolism is when the body, if we have gone to that exhaustion stage, the body starts breaking itself down and using its own tissue for energy. So an example would be if you're under, for some individuals, if you're under really intense stress, some individuals will vomit and some individuals will get diarrhea. And I want us thinking through that a little bit. If we're experiencing really intense stress, that is the body's way for some individuals of saying, hey, we don't have energy for digestion here. Digestion takes energy. We get energy from it, obviously, but it takes energy. And so for some individuals, that either vomiting or getting diarrhea is the body's way of saying, nope, I'm not going to be digesting right now. And it gets rid of anything that is in our GI tract trying to digest. Okay. So what we want, if we're experiencing stress and our body moves into this catabolism stage, we just need to make sure that people are getting enough non-stress and enough rest and enough sleep so that their body has the potential to heal. Any questions about this? Okay. All right. Our autonomic nervous system has these two branches, but I want us to first back up and think a little bit. Our autonomic nervous system has the ability to do a lot of physical functions automatically, which is a blessing for us, okay? We don't have to think every time we breathe. We don't have to think every time we blink our eyes. We don't have to think every time our heart beats. Like if we had to think about all that kind of stuff, we wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. We would just spend all of our thoughts on making our body function like it's supposed to. So the beautiful thing about the autonomic nervous system is it takes care of those automatic functions in our body on its own. Now there are two branches to autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic branch, and the sympathetic branch is going to come on when we are experiencing stress. So sympathetic at its greatest intensity is that fight or flight or freeze response. And sympathetic nervous system response is all about mobilizing energy, okay? So
explain that one more time, because I think you said sympathetic twice, unless I misheard you.
Okay, so sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight or freeze, and it's all about mobilizing energy. Okay, so somebody could be coming at you, attacking you, or it could be the difficult math test. You're going to get that burst of energy all throughout your body. Okay, so things like heart rate's going to increase, our breathing's going to increase, our adrenal glands are going to, spin out adrenaline. Our muscles are going to be getting energy, all of that to be able to mobilize. Okay, so that's sympathetic branch. And keep in mind, stress turns that on. The opposite of sympathetic is the parasympathetic. And the parasympathetic is the healing response. So parasympathetic is on and dominant when we are relaxed, and it's on and dominant when we are sleeping. Okay. And it's going to be that anabolism, so that healing response. Now, here's what I want you to understand about parasympathetic or sympathetic, is that one or the other is dominant at any given time. Like they both can't be on or they both can't be off. It's either one or the other. It's like a teeter-totter. People who are experiencing chronic stress, they keep perceiving the stress sympathetic on, sympathetic on, sympathetic on, sympathetic on. And if parasympathetic doesn't get time on, then that's when the body's going to start breaking down, because the body's not having time for that anabolism and that healing response. So when I talk about sleep as being first line of defense for people with chronic stress, I'm talking about we've got to give them the opportunity. We've got to treat the sleep so that their body can move into that healing anabolism and move into that process. Now, what happens for people under chronic stress is that it's real easy to turn on sympathetic. It's actually pretty challenging to turn on parasympathetic. So one of the things that we do with people with chronic stress is we will do some type of mindfulness or meditation or self-hypnosis or diaphragmatic breathing or progressive muscle relaxation or yoga or a variety of different tools to deliberately turn on parasympathetic branch, which by default turns off the sympathetic branch. Okay. So doing some type of deep relaxation or meditation or yoga, whatever it might be, is very healthy for people when they are under stress. Does that make some sense? Because we're giving their mind and their body the opportunity to heal. And after you train individuals to turn on parasympathetic branch, where they're practicing those things during their waking hours, so they're doing yoga or they're doing diaphragmatic breathing or they're doing meditation or whatever, then their sleep starts to get better, because their body has learned, when you train to turn on parasympathetic, how good that sensation feels. And you need parasympathetic turned on in order to fall asleep also. Any questions about these two branches?
I had a question about, like, you said, like these nervous systems, they're more like chronic stress, but what about someone with like someone who gets panic attacks? Like, how is this related? Like, is this a
Panic attack is classic fight or flight or
sympathetic
freeze.
nervous system?
Yeah. Yeah, that would be when sympathetic branch, boom, it's on. And that person, you know, and you think about what is happening in a panic attack. Person is hyperventilating, their heart's racing, they're probably perspiring. They've got all this energy that feels like really bad nervous energy, but it's their body's been mobilized to move in that way. Yeah. And so you would take somebody who had panic disorder, and one of the things that you do in therapy is to train them in some type of, whether it be, again, it could be yoga, diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, meditation, all kinds of different things, training them in how to utilize that skill that turns on the parasympathetic nervous system. Does that make some sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay. You all have probably heard of this scale. This is a very old scale. Holmes and Rahe developed it years ago. And they've listed on here where people who take this survey, they just identify if they have experienced any of these events in their lives. And Holmes and Rahe would take the number of events and they would add them up for people. And then they try to use it as a predictor, as a measure of stress, as a predictor of illness. But I want us to critique this here. So let's say death of a spouse. That is going to be, for different people, situational. Okay. If you are a 30-year-old woman with small children at home and your spouse is out driving, going to work one morning and gets in a car accident and dies, that experience of that event is probably going to be very different than, let's say you're an 85-year-old woman you've been caretaking for your husband who has been seriously ill and in pain, and his body's been wasting away. And then finally in his sleep, he finally passes one night. Isn't that going to feel very different than that 30-year-old woman? You bet. Yeah. So Holmes and Rahe just kind of, and even like number 2, divorce for some individuals could be total freedom. And for others, it could be this horrible tragedy, as an example. What they did not take into account was, I would call it the valence of, is this a good thing that happened to them, and how good is it, versus is this a bad thing that happened to them and how bad is it? Okay. And then you all can probably relate down here, for this is a scale that is used for undergraduate students. So finals week, applying to graduate school, being a victim of crime, stuff like that. Okay. So in the original research, Holmes and Rahe, they studied these individuals that were in the service, and they found a very small correlation between the scores on the scale and illness. But again, if we were to use a measure that took a look at the valence, positive, negative, and how, we get a much cleaner relationship between level of perceived stress and illness. Okay. Another way that we've measured stress would be just kind of counting up daily hassles. So things like making mistakes or creating our own accident, noticing that we're broke and we've got bills to pay and we can't pay them, so we're going to have to pay interest on the bills, stuff like that. Okay. So psychologists are obsessed with measuring things. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of the history of this when it comes to stress. Okay. Let's talk about this stress appraisal process that we go through. And we go through these 2 steps. Most of us go through these 2 steps very, very quickly, that it almost seems like it's 1 step and not 2 steps. But the first thing, when there's a stressor, a potential stressor in our environment, is we go through primary appraisal. And in primary appraisal, we kind of ask ourselves, how bad is this? How threatening is this? Or is this bad, or is this good? And if we determine that it's not a threat, then the stress is done. We're done. Okay. If, on the other hand, we see this stimulus or this antecedent in their environment and we're like, oh, this is really bad. This is really threatening. I just got an unexpected bill for $1,000 from my insurance company and I am broke. I got nothing in my checking account. The secondary appraisal, if we've determined it's a threat in primary, we move into secondary. And in secondary is, can I cope with this? My parents said they'd be willing to give me a loan so I can pay off my bills and not pay interest. That would sort of be like, oh, thank goodness I've got that help here. But if we determine it's a threat and then we're like, oh, I can't cope with it, then we're experiencing the full-blown stress perception. Okay. From a therapeutic standpoint, when we are helping an individual adapt their primary appraisal, here we are oftentimes doing cognitive therapy. Okay. So it'd be taking that which is threatening and seeing, is there a different way of thinking about it? So again, that person who's pretty overwhelmed at work, where boss just came and gave them this brand new project that they want them to lead, you could either perceive that as, oh my gosh, I've got so much work and now he's laying more on me. Or you could perceive it as, hey, I really want to be promoted. This is an opportunity for me to be able to show my leadership style, to show my management strategies. This is an opportunity for me to prove myself. And if all goes well after I lead this project, then I'm going to sit down with my boss and I'm going to ask for a raise. So cognitive therapy here. And then what do you think we're going to be doing over here in secondary appraisal? This is going to be more behavioral therapy. Okay. We're going to be building up coping skills for individuals. And this is going to be a lot more action oriented. So more behavioral here, targeting secondary appraisal, more cognitive here, targeting primary appraisal. And so you can sort of see, it makes a lot of sense when we do cognitive behavioral therapy for individuals, we are taking care of all of this. Does that make some sense? Okay, cool. Okay, so here's a possible exam question, because I know many of you are thinking about the exam that is happening tomorrow, which I can open it up this evening right after we get done with class, so you can take it anytime between now and 5 tomorrow. So Julie has been feeling overwhelmed at work and at home with her family responsibilities. Her boss just gave her a brand new huge project to lead. Julia thinks to herself, I just can't handle anything else right now, especially this. This would be an example of what?
Primary appraisal.
Yeah, she's perceiving it as a threat. Good job. Okay. This is going to feel really intuitive for you all, but we're just going to kind of walk through it. These are normal characteristics of stressful situations. Life transitions tend to be stressful for many of us. So moving from home, going away to college, parenthood, particularly first baby. Parents get a little more nervous with first babies than they get if there are additional babies that come along later on. Then they get more comfortable because they built up the efficacy for that. Having to relocate, the end of an important relationship, moving into retirement. I've known some individuals that move into retirement and then they come out of retirement. They go back to work because retirement was not what they necessarily dreamed it would be. So big life transitions, that's going to make sense. Difficult timing. Unexpected pregnancy for a 15-year-old. And then the flip side of that one would be somebody who's been very careful with birth control all throughout their sexual history, and then they decide they want to have a child a little bit later in life, and then they're struggling with infertility. Like when it comes time they want to get pregnant, they can't. Ambiguity is something that a lot of our medical patients experience on a regular basis. And if you've ever had yourself or you've ever had family members go through that kind of stuff, if you've got these symptoms, you go to the doctor, they run tests, you have to wait for the test results. And then, either the test results are good, the test results are bad, and then you got to figure out what kind of treatment. And is it going to be a treatment that's going to be win-win-win, or is it going to be a treatment that's going to be painful, like chemotherapy, where the person's going to have a lot of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, maybe lose their hair, maybe lose a lot of weight because of the chemotherapy. So ambiguity and uncertainty is very stressful. And I think all of you, regardless of what you've been experiencing in this pandemic, we've got a lot of ambiguity that we are dealing with right now. Like, we just don't know. We've got projections of when we will have vaccines, but are the vaccines going to work well and build immunity? Are the vaccines going to be safe? Are the vaccines going to be available, as an example? There's just a lot we don't know. Like, how long is this going to go on? We know that stressful events involve low desirability. So an example would be being put on furlough and losing your job, getting a traffic ticket, a natural disaster. I had an occasion recently where I was going up 195, and indeed I was speeding, and there was a police car behind me that turned on its lights, and I was like, oh, they got me, And so I was in the left lane, I move over to the right lane, and I'm experiencing stress. I'm like, oh crap, I'm going to get pulled over and get a ticket. And then the police car went on by me, and it was like, yeah. So I went from this like, oh no, like, I'm going to get a ticket, to, oh yay, it's not me. They're after somebody else. So ups and downs, all within a minute. The fourth one, low controllability. You see this a lot in people with chronic pain. If they don't have the tools to know how to manage their pain, we will talk about that later in the semester, how to do that and how to help people with that. Somebody who's got OCD or has had some kind of traumatic trauma in their past, and they can't stop remembering it. They keep having these intrusive memories, and they can't control their thoughts. And real quickly right here, folks, I will tell you, this kind of fits with both CBT, and it fits with ACT. We cannot control our thoughts. Thoughts are additive, And so if we have thoughts and we try not to think those thoughts, guess what happens?
They come back stronger.
Yeah, it backfires. Like trying not to think about something actually makes us think about it even more. So I'm going to do a real quick exercise here with you all. And this is based on a classic experiment, psychological experiment. For the next couple of seconds, I'm going to ask that you close your eyes and you can think about anything you want to think about, but I do not want you thinking about a white bear. Okay, open your eyes. How many of you saw a polar bear and you couldn't stop thinking about a polar bear? The white bear? Okay, let's do a second experiment. For the next couple of seconds, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, and I absolutely do not want you thinking about a white bear, but I want you to picture in your mind's eye and think about a red fire engine. Okay, come back. How many of you now, there was a polar bear and there was a fire engine somehow interacting with maybe the polar bear? Yeah, some people, it's like the polar bear standing in front of the fire engine, and some that it's riding on the back, you know, playfully. Sometimes the polar bear is driving the fire engine, but it's that kind of thing of like when you try not to think about something, especially if you've got any OCD kinds of tendencies, you try not to think about something and it backfires. You think about it even more. Okay. And some of the learning process that is happening there is negative reinforcement. You are trying not to think about something. You're trying to subtract, but the thing that gets reinforced is the obsessive thought. And then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay. Any questions here on characteristics of stressful situations? All righty. Okay. So these are some of the things that your generation is dealing with that, say, my generation or my parents' generation did not necessarily have to deal with. We've already talked about the bowling alone effect, having to move away from extended family. And again, an upside of a bachelor's degree is you're going to have a much better career than without a bachelor's degree. But a lot of times people get their degree and they have to go to where the job is at. And in doing so, moving away from extended family. We have a lot more reliance on social media now. And for some individuals, social media brings them closer together to other people. But in a lot of situations, if people over-rely on social media, they're doing so at the expense of having real relationships in real time. Okay. And I realize we're in a weird situation right now with this pandemic that we're doing, you know, Zoom meetings and FaceTime and Google Hangouts. And a lot of us are having relationships online, whereas in the past we were able to have live relationships. But social media can be problematic, particularly if there's any bullying going on in social media. Okay. We've done some research in our lab on people being cyberbullied or people being bullied in person. And the cyberbullying is especially bad because in cyberbullying, if you're the victim of it, you can go back and view it over and over again. It's like you can almost relive that bullying experience. But with the social media bullying, other people are seeing it too. So it's one thing to be bullied by somebody yourself. It's a whole other thing to know that people who know you know about that. They know about that abuse or they know about that bullying. The amount of negative information that we're exposed to in daily life. When I was growing up, it was a family ritual every evening. We would sit down and we would watch a half an hour of the national news. And that was like a tradition that when my sons were growing up, we did the same thing. We would sit down in the evenings and we would watch a half an hour of national news. Nowadays, you've got people exposed to either Fox, CNN, whatever it is, 24-hour news cycle. And there are some individuals who, you know, imagine if your television was on and you're hearing about the pandemic and you're hearing about the federal government and you're hearing about these protests that are going on and you're hearing about violence. Like if you were consuming that around the clock, just think of how miserable, how anxious and how miserable you could be. right? Because it's rarely uplifting news. So one of the things that, and I do this myself, I've been doing this for a while. I try to get my news in just small doses so that I feel like I'm staying up to date, but I don't overdo it. And if you're working with people that are really struggling with anxiety or depression or stress, a lot of times we ask them, how much social media are you using? How much television news are you watching? And we ask people to either take a full break from it, or we ask them to limit the dose of those things. Does that make some sense? Yeah, it's too much. It can be just overwhelming. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and this is just really good personal psychological advice for you all, that the more we take our negative feelings, so the more that we take our own anxiety or our own stress or our own feeling kind of sad and down, depression, and the more we try not to feel those feelings, it's like the polar bear. The more people try to avoid and suppress those feelings, the more likely those feelings are going to expand and get worse. Okay, I'll give you an example that I went through a couple of years ago. So I had taken my kitty Boo, my Foo-Foo kitty, to the vet, and found out that she had lost weight and she had a heart murmur. And I remember that evening, that was like a Thursday evening, I remember crying myself asleep because I was really afraid that she'd been losing weight, that this heart disease was taking her life. She's still alive now. She hangs out in the basket in the laundry room. She's fine. But at that point in time, that news was, my kitty's very sick. She's losing weight and she's probably going to die soon. So I was really sad and I cried myself to sleep. The next evening, Friday evening, our neighbors came over and said, I think your kitty cat is dead under our bush. And this is a different cat. This was my big, huge Maine Coon, Griffey. And we go over to Griffey and he's barely breathing. And we end up taking him to the vet and having Griffey put down on Friday evening. So then I cry myself to sleep on Friday evening, and then I cry all throughout the day on Saturday, and I cry myself to sleep Saturday evening, to the point where my family members, everybody was grieving, but my family members were getting worried about me. I woke up Sunday morning and I let everybody know, it's like, okay, I think I'm done. I think I'm done crying. But it's like I had to go through that. Does that make some sense? Like those feelings were real. Like I was worried about my Foo-Foo kitty, had to put down my big old Maine Coon kitty. I was just really sad and I needed to grieve. But because I thoroughly grieved, I was able to kind of get past it. So take that kind of analogy and think about, this is where people get into trouble, where they take their stress or their sadness or whatever, and they try not to feel it. It just comes back in a fury. But if you face up to the emotion, it's sort of like cry yourself asleep when you're sad about your kitty cats. If you face the emotion and you process the emotion, that's the only way we as human beings get beyond it. Does that make some sense? So avoidance gets people into a lot of trouble. Okay, so social media, we've already talked a little bit about this, but we've talked about the anonymous bullying. Body snarking is an area that I've done some research and some writing in. I've got a book chapter all about body snarking. That is where individuals pick on other people based on their appearance. So either they're involved in fat shaming somebody, or they're picking on their clothing, or they're picking on how they look in some way. That is especially a pernicious and a harmful, hurtful thing that people are able to do on social media. Sometimes people get addicted to the number of likes. We did a study years ago where we asked college students about their social media use, whether it was Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. And we found that the people with the lowest self-esteem were also the people that say that they would take down posts when they didn't get enough likes. And the people with higher self-esteem, if they would post something and they didn't get many likes, it was like no big deal to them. They just kind of moved on with their lives. So I thought that was kind of interesting how that kind of online social media behavior can be a function of one's self-esteem. And And then smartphones, smartphone use. I don't, people aren't going out to restaurants nowadays, but one of the things that would sadden me back in the days when we go to restaurants is to see a whole family sitting around a table and everybody is on their phone. Everybody's, looking at their phone as opposed to having conversation with one another. And then a lot of parents, as an example, using things like that to babysit their kids, giving a kid a cell phone or an iPad kind of as a babysitter. All right. Okay, I want to spend a minute, and I know that not everybody in here has had the psychopathology class if you're a psych major or the abnormal psych class if you're a non-major, but I do want to just spend a bit of time here talking about psychological disorders. And obviously, everybody has a breaking point, but obviously severe stress is going to be causal in the development of a psychological disorder. So people who get depressed, people who get anxiety disorders, eating disorders, there's usually very severe stress going on in their lives, okay? So stress causing psychological disorders. But I want to go beyond that. Having a psychological disorder in and of itself brings on its own stress, okay? So I want to think about this kind of vicious cycle that happens for a lot of individuals. They're under severe stress, develop a psychological disorder. That psychological disorder is adding to their stress. And it's no wonder that people have their breaking point. And once they develop a psychological disorder, a lot of times it grows. Okay. The depression gets worse. The anxiety gets worse. The eating disorder, it was binging and purging once a day, and now it's up to 5 times a day. It grows. Okay. Which is why I'm a strong believer that primary care, healthcare in our culture does not regularly screen for psychological disorders. Some primary care doctors do, and I think that is a wonderful thing. We should be screening in healthcare. If we're in primary care, whether we're a PA, MD, DO, whatnot, we should be screening. And remember, we talked about the Prime MD, that 1-page paper and pencil test. People can complete it within like 3 minutes, and it flags for the most common psychological disorders. We are capable of doing this. It's just not necessarily mainstream practice in all primary care practices. So psychological disorders are stressful. And then again, I know not everybody in here has had abnormal psych or psychopathology, but personality disorders are when people have very rigid. We talked about psychological flexibility versus rigidity when we talked about ACT. Personality disorders are when people have very rigid patterns in the way that they think, the way that they feel, and the way that they behave. And it's sort of like they've got this way of thinking, and they've got this way of doing things, or they've got this way of relating to other people, and that's the only way they know how. Like they just keep doing it that way when maybe the situation calls for some flexibility up here and doing it this way, but they keep doing it that way, okay? And if you look at some of the common personality disorders, what is really sad about the person who has the personality disorder is that the thing in life that they most want to get is oftentimes the way that they are behaving very rigidly over and over again. Their behavior is preventing them from getting that thing that they most need. So it's very self-defeating behavior, okay? Personality disorders. But then people who have a personality disorder, they think that the world is stressful, the world is bad, but they don't have the insight to realize, hey, dude, if you just stop doing things exactly that rigid way that you keep doing things, your life would get better. Maybe you could get what you need. So sadly, an example would be a narcissist is really looking for true love and true connection and true admiration from others. But they are so arrogant and so haughty and so self-absorbed, and they don't have empathy for other people. They can't see other people's perspectives, so that they want this love and this connection, but they behave in a way that pushes people away. So we got a Shakespearean tragedy going on here. A person with borderline personality disorder, what they oftentimes want, these are people that have really, really rocky up and down emotions, really rocky and chaotic relationships with other people. These individuals are oftentimes looking for peace and happiness. But the way that they behave creates so much drama and so much chaos. And then they're so sensitive in their skin. And then they've just got this rocky emotions up and down. A paranoid personality disorder person, they're really looking to belong and to have other people understand them, but they're so paranoid and so suspicious that they push people away. Like, it's just painful to be around somebody who's just paranoid all the time. So Sigmund Freud, I'm not going to get real Freudian here, but Sigmund Freud would talk about ego strength. And his ego would be this thing that is in between the id. The id is I want, I want, I want. The super ego is like societal rules. Well, you may want this, but you gotta follow the rules and you gotta get it the right way. When Freud talked about ego strength, he talked about if we have a strong ego, you can kind of put this in your notes as self-esteem. If we have a strong ego, we can regulate between the id going, I want, I want, I want, and the super ego going, no, we've got social rules on how you do that. Good ego strength manages between those things. A fragile ego would be like somebody with really poor self-esteem, where you can't regulate between I want, and versus the super ego and social rules. So ego strength is a good thing. Questions here, because I know this is a lot and we've really sort of pulled in abnormal psych. Okay. So somewhere in here, I've let you know psychological disorders happen because of stress, but psychological disorders are stressful. Personality disorders are really stressful for the people who have it, again, because they think the world is like against them or people are against them, but they can't see that they're contributing to that. So personality disorders are very challenging to treat, even with, we're talking long-term psychotherapy. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about this experiment here, where this is just an example of classical conditioning, where in this experiment in mice, they were able to take this drug that automatically would lower the immune system. It would suppress the immune system. And in this mouse experiment, they just simply, it's kind of like Pavlov pairing the bell with the food for the dogs. In this situation, they paired it with this water that had a little saccharin in it. So it had a little sweetener, but it didn't have carbohydrate. And the reason why they flavored the water is because it was unique. Like, the mouse knows what water tastes like. Water tastes like water. But when you sweeten the water, and you would pair that sweet water with this drug that lowered the immune system, after pairing that, you could just give these mice the sweet water, and lo and behold, you would see their immune system suppress. So basically what this experiment is showing, that at least short-term in mammals, short-term only, we haven't seen a long-term solution to this. Short-term, we can actually classically condition our immune system to suppress, or we can short-term we can classically condition our immune system to upregulate and get stronger.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, at least short term, it is possible for us to classically condition our immune system down to less functioning, or upregulate to better functioning. And somewhere in this, it's kind of like Pavlov's dogs classically conditioning digestion, like saliva and the gastric juices. We can classically condition and operantly condition our own physiology. And that's going to be important in helping people manage stress, because we want to train people to turn on that parasympathetic nervous system, and by default, turn off the sympathetic nervous system. So somewhere in here, it's easy to sort of think that our physical bodies and our physiology just happen to us, but actually it's possible to have learning involved. Okay. So let's talk about the really mean things that scientists do to mice at times. So in this particular experiment, what they did is they take these mice, they're all nice and healthy, and they randomly assign them. Half of the mice get to go to a mouse hotel and they have really low stress. So they've got their wheel they can run on, they got their food, their water, their bedding, happy mice, okay? Then they randomly assign the other half of the mice to a really stressful condition. And in some of the research, what they do is they just keep shocking the mice, like they put a little electrode on their tail and they just keep shocking them over and over again. That's a rough day in mice land. Another thing that they do that's even, to me, is even more horrific, they put mice in a bucket of water and they have to swim for their lives. And if they stop swimming, they sink and they drown, and there's no ledge, like they just meet the side of the bucket. So they just have to keep swimming or they die. That is I don't know about y'all, but that sounds like a horrific day in mice land, okay? And then what they had done before they send them to the mouse hotel or they send them to the bucket swimming, they inject them with X amount of malignant cancer. And after they either live in the low stress mouse hotel or they swim for their lives, they sacrifice them. So they kill these mice. And then they take a look at how much that malignant tumor grows. And lo and behold, this is very intuitive, you all, that the mice that were swimming for their lives, remember about 15% of our energy is our immune system, they exhaust. They absolutely exhaust, and the cancer takes over in their little mouse bodies. The mice that were injected with malignant tumor that lived in the low stress environment, those tumors either went away or did not grow very much, okay? And this is stressful for us to think about, but all of us here, whether or not we've ever had a diagnosable cancer, we've all had cancer cells in our bodies. All of us had. It's just a part of normal cell mutation and an abnormal cell mutation. We've all had cancer cells. But if we have a healthy immune system, our immune system has found those cancer cells and gotten rid of them in our bodies. So doesn't it make sense that if people have so much severe stress and their body goes to exhaustion, that it would be easy not only to get a cold or a flu or a bacterial infection, it can also spin out cancer for people. Okay, so you saw Janet Kegel-Glaser in The New Medicine. She was the health psychologist. She's married to Glaser, who is the virologist, and they work together in a team. They've done some beautiful mind-body research throughout their careers working together. And they just simply know that immunosuppression, so downregulation of the immune system, so not humming along at 15%, but humming along less than that, maybe 10%, maybe 5%. Human immunosuppression follows chronic stress. And these are just, these are going to make some sense. These events that happen to people oftentimes will downregulate their immune system, and then people tend to get sick after that. And they've definitely found there's a dose response. A little bit of stress is fine, but huge, severe stress that's prolonged is really bad for us. Okay. In this model of research, what Cohen and some of his colleagues have done is they get these volunteers who come into the lab and they get this saline solution injected into their sinuses. And the saline is either a placebo, it does not have any cold virus, or randomly assigned. Some individuals get the saline solution that does have the cold virus in it. And lo and behold, they find that you can predict who gets a cold and the severity, like the severity of symptoms and the length of the cold by individuals who are reporting more acute stress. Okay. So it's one thing some people under low stress, they get that cold virus and their immune system takes care of it. People under chronic stress, they're going to get that cold virus injected into them and they're a lot more likely to get a severe cold. Make sense? And this is especially the case for viral infections. You don't see this kind of relationship nearly as strong for like bacterial infections, but you definitely see it for things like mono, Epstein-Barr virus, these viruses that create very chronic fatigue, pain and chronic fatigue. Okay. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and close out and burn the first half. So this is part 1 of stress. And then I'll meet you all back here in 2 minutes and we will pick up with part 2. Okay. Why are you not